Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to our webinar roundtable discussion, Navigating DORA Compliance, Insights from Industry Leaders. We're going to be talking through the Digital Operational Resilience Act and the impact that it's going to have, that it's likely to have on the finance industry. Anybody who deals with digital money or finance related business. We've got a wonderful panel of guests today. I'm going to introduce them now. From Amazon Web Services, we have Maria Tsani. She is the head of financial services, public policy, and regulatory affairs for EMEA. Maria, thank you for joining us today. We also, from Amazon Web Services, have Eric Barron, who is a global sales leader in DevOps and generative AI for the financial services vertical. We have from Deloitte, this morning and I haven't had enough coffee, Ganesh Sithramannan, and I'm sure I did that wrong. I'm sorry.
You're perfectly fine.
But he is experts in in cloud platforms and infrastructure from Deloitte. And from Nobl9, we have co-founder Brian Singer. And I'm Dan Ruby. I'm the one who's going to be butchering names and asking silly questions. So let's start with Maria. Maria, DORA is on the doorstep, the DORA step, if you will. And there's a lot around DORA that seems to be still kind of undefined. There's a lot of concern about what kind of change we're going to have to implement to be able to meet these regulations. Can you give us a brief overview of how you view DORA? What financial institutions should, at a very high level, expect, and what kind of an outcome do you think that this is going to provide for customers of these financial institutions?
Sure, thank you, and morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone, depending where you are. I'm based in Spain, so afternoon for all the Europeans on the line. And I can confirm it's also very hot here in Spain. So, but it's sunny, so we're very happy. Thanks, Sam, for the question. So I think the first thing, kind of taking a step back, thinking about where DORA came from, because it hasn't kind of come out of nowhere. DORA is really the continuation of the work by European regulators on the topic of operational resilience and outsourcing more broadly. Before DORA, we had what was effectively a patchwork of what we call guidelines in the EU financial services regulatory space. And guidelines are not applicable they're not automatically applicable to every member state across the EU. So DORA basically came to harmonize that patchwork of guidelines that we had across the EU. And it really kind of shows and materializes the shift in focus from European regulators and I would argue globally, from market risk and credit risk, which were the obvious places to start with after the financial crisis, to operational risk, which is now, I would argue, equally as important as capital and liquidity for financial regulators. So in that regard, I think it is important to understand that DORA is not simply a compliance checklist. It's not seen as that by the financial regulators. It's a principles-based framework that is looking to increase the resiliency and the security of all types of financial entities, and it's very broad in its scope. in that sense. It goes from banks to insurance to asset managers, etc. You name it. MiCA supervised entities, so it's very broad in scope, but it's really a holistic framework that has the overall objective of raising the bar when it comes to operational resilience and security, and it really takes the issue from only the IT guys in a financial entity to the very top of the organization. So one of the things that if you read DORA that really kind of comes through is, given the topic of operational resilience and cybersecurity, the relevance that needs to be addressed even at the board level and from the board down. And if you look at DORA, there's requirements there, or there are provisions there that talk about making sure that your operational resilience strategy, your cyber, on your digital strategy more generally, fits into the wider strategy of your financial entity. So there is this idea that cyber resilience, risk is not just IT, is not just the work of the IT guys in a separate building to the main floor of the financial entity, but it's really a core part of the overall strategy of the entity, and therefore needs the attention of the very top of the organization.
Right.
And just to add, I'll shut up. Otherwise, I'll keep talking I'll take over the whole seminar. But you said that we are, there's still a lot in flow, and that is true. I've been refreshing my browser every minute today, because we are expecting the publication of the final batch of regulatory technical standards by the ESAs. So these are coming out literally any moment now, and we're obviously waiting to look what's in there and assess them.
Thank you. That's really interesting about, bringing, kind of bridging that gap between IT and the business side of financial organizations. Ganesh, I'll ask you, how have your clients kind of approached this, and what are some of the main concerns that they've had?
Again, thanks, Dan. As Maria referred to, right, I think the regulations, especially DORA, has transcended beyond what I call as the general best practices of moving from vulnerability management into much more of a risk management as well, right? Now the risk management transcends. The customer's concern is, okay, how do I manage the risk, but how does it transcend into and directly impact the customer landscape? Because it's basically about, hey, the DORA is protecting the customer in a way to go back and improve the customer experience and the perception of the financial institutions, right? Whether the service they provide, whether the service they consume, naturally that goes and have an impact on the brand reputation. I think that Maria is referring to. That's why it goes all the way across to the board as well. So the customer's reaction is, I think the eagerly waiting tech standards is what I think everybody's looking at, saying that, okay, should I be going back into addressing this proactively, about to address this operational resilience in such a way that, one, how do I go manage and avoid this whole incident reporting process? Two is about how do I go back and manage my customer expectations in a way that, okay, I'm not getting damaged on the brand reputation perspective. Three, how do I operationalize it with all the capabilities of what you see in the technology that's available today, whether it's be it a hyperscaler, be in a hybrid world. How do I go back and consume that in such a way that I can operationalize within the organization? So that's the customer's anticipation of this tech standards about how do we go back and take it forward.
Okay, that's fantastic, Brian. I'll put this one on Brian. When you're talking to customers, I know you spend a lot of time talking to customers about this whole concept of bridging the gap between resilience and reliability and kind of the business goals. With DORA again on the horizon, do you find that this is a continuation of what a lot of organizations are already trying to do, or do you think that this is more of an impetus for more of a modernization process?
So I think it goes without saying that everybody wants to be reliable enough for customers. I think what this is spurring, like Maria said, is more of a tops-down investigation of what does that mean for our business, and how do we build standards into how software is built and delivered such that we can guarantee reliability for our most critical services. I would say the shift is, I think, a realization that without understanding the standards for performance and reliability, it's very hard to create resiliency requirements. So, for example, if I have a service that is not business critical, that only needs to be 99% available, that's going to dictate a certain architecture to get me to a certain level of resilience. Whereas if there's a service that needs to be available, 4 or 5 nines, that's going to dictate a separate set of standards, and then monitoring that and tracking it, I think, is going to be required to satisfy regulators, because when they say, well, why aren't all your services 5 nines or whatever, you have to have a good answer for that. The reality is it's nearly impossible and way too expensive to make everything 4 or 5 nines available, and it's kind of a waste of money because customers won't care.
Eric, I'll go to you now. With the clients that you've talked to in the financial industry, you have your ear to the ground with all of this on the kind of clientele perspective. Is there a particular concern that is like outweighing the rest? And do you feel that are the financial institutions viewing this as a technology challenge or a change management challenge?
Well, in a classic, probably consulting answer, it's both there, Dan. But let's we'll unpack this a little bit. So, I've actually been back at AWS now, 2 tours of duty, and saw this on the public sector side back in 2016. And part of the reason I was interested in coming back to AWS in the financial services space in general was because about 3 years ago, there was a shift from kind of an if we're going to move to cloud. And it's no secret that most of the global financials have kind of built their own private clouds and done some of that type of work to kind of get themselves ready. But it's really now more of a when and how quickly. And the kind of marriage between a regulation like DORA being this kind of evolution, as Maria, you kind of alluded to, but kind of a new publication of the way we need to be thinking about resiliency and reliability. It's creating this major kind of look backwards process, because I know that as a global financial entity, I may have an estate of 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 application workloads that could be decomposed into kind of base workloads when you kind of think of the tiers of the workload itself. But really, when we think about applications, customers are coming to AWS and really our teams and are asking us to look at a couple of different fronts. One is obviously, help me understand the proper mix of AWS services, Lego bricks that I need to approve that can be utilized in the ways that teams are going to start to think about building environments in the infrastructure that workload or application will then sit on top of. And then I need a way to manage how I'm incrementing the different features, the different governance controls and standards that I'm actually baking into the self-service workflow for the developer. And what's been happening is we're getting called in quite a bit, where the financial institutions are kind of almost saying something along these lines. Hey, you've been at this game for a long time. You've seen what really good cloud transformation looks like. And we'll even get the question sometimes, can you kind of talk to me about what Netflix does? And the response always is, yeah, we can certainly describe what that looks like. But a global financial is not born in a cloud company. There is a significant level of process, people, tooling, languages, systems that span somewhere to the tune of 50, 60,000 software engineers inside some of these global banks. And when we look at that side of it, trying to get the proper service mix approved, there's also an effort that really is even more foundational, which is I have all of this tooling that sits out in my environment. And if I'm even going to get to a point where I can gauge how effective was I in what went into each of those application releases, how do I look at baking in different types of service level optimization requirements into the workload I'm trying to migrate over? How am I starting to think about engineering more of the governance frameworks as part of the developer process, not something we're trying to make sure we're re-engineering prior to actually moving or migrating that particular workload into the cloud? There's a large kind of set of efforts that are kind of going across those fronts. And the ones that are doing it right are the ones that are kind of thinking about the tooling consolidation, because the data that sits under them is probably one of the most critical assets that they have in order to bake and understand what that future state, as they're really taking advantage of cloud, looks like in a 3 to 5 year span. So the conversations that we're having when it really comes back to reliability and resiliency are much broader in, I want to look at the estate here. I don't want to just be thinking about this workload moving to this process or this particular cloud provider, this workload moving to a cloud provider, et cetera. We want to start to encapsulate that in a more Lego book approach. And regulations like DORA being passed are really actually giving us an inflection point beyond just we're thinking about migrating to cloud platforms. It's giving us an inflection point to also come in and say, let's make sure that we are automating and hardening a lot of the compliance controls that you're going to need to evolve to over the course of time. Make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So Ganesh, when you go into a customer right now, when Deloitte goes into a customer and they're getting ready for DORA, do you have kind of a step-by-step, here's how we should start approaching your environment, your resilience and reliability in order to comply with DORA as best we understand it now?
Yeah, I think I'll take a step back and break down into multiple ways as well. I think just DORA is evolving, or it's coming across. I think specific calls on DORA is much more what I call as an exploratory or educational basis.
Mm-hmm.
I believe most of the conversations, what we have, as Brian and Eric was referring to as well, right? The thing about, hey, how do I modernize, or how do I run my current ecosystem in a way that I can go add the resiliency or reliability to it? So one of the lens what we Deloitte do it is, we look at resilience of applications across 7 dimensions. That's how we go back and look at it based upon where they want to go back and improve it. So what we call is, hey, it's not always the recovery of a situation that you run into. So that's one of the biggest DORA's prime principles and articles is, hey, it's about how do you keep running? How are you reliable, having a service that's very critical service that's very reliable? And then how do you introduce the robustness, and how do you go back and have a good hygiene within the ecosystem to manage it, right? So that's the framework we go back. What we have is, we look this across 7 dimensions, across 7 pillars, across 55 capabilities is how we go approach this. And that's one way of looking at it. So the other thing is about what we look at is about, the very big thing was how do you build transparency? Because it's like, as Brian pointed out, like a cost to manage a resilience and reliability across an ecosystem is going to be expensive. Where do you want to put a focus on? Where do you want to invest? And how do you build the transparency in such a way to go back and manage the metric, right? So if you look at, do you want to have a reactive metrics to go back and do an MTTR, or do you want to go back and try to manage to the error budgets in the modern market to do it? Because such a way that you have a traceability that you can go back to the regulatories, whether there's a change that is introduced, or whether it's a third party that's been consumption that's been introduced or not as well. So we look this in multiple dimensions. Mm-hmm. Then as the last point, what I will also say is, like, as Eric pointed out, a lot of our clients ask about is about how do you go back and adopt and drive this, drive this modernization effort, especially with this distributed computing, introducing a lot of complexities. How do you break those down? How do I go back and try to consume this? One, the reason is because one, not only it introduces system complexity to manage and run. Two, it adds a lot of fatigue to the organization by in itself, because right now with the shift left mentality, the expectations on the developers are going higher and higher right now to build a solid system to do that. So that's why we talk about all the 7x7 framework as a holistically and trying to go back and say, all right, yes, the regulation is driving it. Yes, that's the mandate. But let's go look at, okay, what's the incremental step that we can get you there in such a way that we have a solid foundation to get you up to meet the expectations.
I would add to that, if it's okay, Dan, that one of the things DORA seems to look for is a very structured way to detect and manage incidents. And I think it can be very hard to agree on what actually constitutes an incident without an objective measure there. SLOs are nice because they give you a way to establish what are the requirements we're trying to hit from a performance and customer experience standpoint. And then it's very easy to objectively say whether there's an incident based on how much error budget is burned or burning or available, versus sort of trying to finger in the air. Well, we might have had customer impact, we might not have. There were 2 customers impacted. Does that constitute an incident? So I think it's very, very hard to establish that framework without some objective way to talk about, how are these services supposed to be performing?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point around what constitutes an incident, what constitutes something that needs to be reported to regulators under a DORA framework, or one of the many other similar frameworks around the around the world. Maria, I know AWS has done a lot of work to provide infrastructure and tooling that people can leverage to make sure that they're, living up to these regulatory expectations. Can you kind of talk us through some best practices about using AWS to drive a more resilient and a more kind of transparently reliable product?
Yeah, first of all, I think I would say that, it's not just me saying it, but it's international regulators also saying that cloud can actually enhance the resiliency of the financial system. That is something that Bank of England, the Financial Stability Board has said. So it's not just us and saying it as a cloud provider, but it's something that regulators acknowledge it. Obviously, in the context of DORA, we'll have to see how we embed the shared responsibility model within the framework. And as you know, under the shared responsibility model, we look after the security and resiliency of the cloud, and our customers look at the security and resiliency in the cloud. And DORA remains technology neutral, I should say. So there are no restrictions for the adoption of cloud, which is obviously very important. So our customers will be able to use all the tools we have, for example, the resiliency hub, to check their resiliency posture. We just published recently an updated version of what we call the financial lens of our well-architected framework. And that's a document that would help our financial services customers in their deployment of AWS. And we have recently launched a DORA guide, which I would be happy to share the link with everyone. I'll share it in the chat box of the app, but also we can circulate the link to that. And it kind of talks about all the tools that we have already available for our customers to be able to meet with the requirements as of 2025. But the other thing I wanted to add, which is kind of going back to the previous what the previous panelists talked about, and going back to the point about, is DORA a compliance list or no? I mean, you can see it as a compliance list, but I think it's a wasted opportunity for everyone in the market, in the industry, to be looking at this. I mean, the way I see it and the way we see it at AWS is that DORA is really an opportunity to really catalyst investment into the best technology that you can have, because DORA looks at the future. So you really need to be future-proofing your business to what what's gonna happen in the future. So you talk there's a lot about incident reporting, but there's a lot about risk management in there, and how you deal with emerging threats, and how your risk management framework adapts to that. So really you can see, I would encourage everyone, and I've been in banking before, so I know that compliance functions will hate me for saying this, but this is really an opportunity to put your money, in simple words, put your money where it's really going to get you there in the future. And I think kind of ties nicely with what I was saying before about how businesses are looking at this.
Yeah. Oh, Brian, go ahead.
Can I address something Maria said? Just in terms of everybody outside of financial services also looking at DORA and what it's asking for. I think it's a really great point you're making, Maria, because I think any service provider to a financial services institution is going to eventually fall under DORA. Because if I'm a dependency for a financial services company, they're probably going to be asking us to follow the same requirements from an incident reporting standpoint, because if I have an incident, they're going to need to know about it. Similar to security reporting, right? If I have a security incident, all of my contracts today say I have to notify my customer within 24, 48 hours, and so on and so on. So I believe that is going to be coming for the rest of the ecosystem as well.
Absolutely. So Dan, if I want to add to what Maria and Brian said as well, I think the opportunity that is available through the DORA for all the leaders, all the financial institutions, or who are that may be regulators or compliance hours, or it depends upon the role. I believe as an institution, if you look at it, I think it's going back with an intent of saying that, okay, how do I go maintain my operational resiliency by anticipating something that's going to happen, rather than to go back and say, oh, can I prevent and respond? Because that puts a lot of engineering thing, like what Eric was talking about, right? If you as a development manager or IT leader or a board leader, how do I anticipate to do that? So that's where the dynamics of things comes in from a technology. How do I leverage? Okay, what are the tools that I have? How do I compose it? How do I go back and run this on a regular basis is what the opportunity is here, rather than going back and say, how do I prevent and respond back and report on it? I think it should be much more on an earlier space about how do you anticipate in such a way, avoid those things, rather than you don't run into those problems.
It's interesting you brought up, what tools do I have? Because I know with a lot of organizations, they've got big investments in their current infrastructure, the current monitoring tools, different services, different products, different divisions will have different separate tools. How much of a challenge does that kind of the creep, if you will, of tools being used, and then to an extent the walls between data sources, the walls between segments of the organization, how much does that provide a challenge for getting a more standardized regulation focused capacity to manage risk and to manage incidents and to report on them?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, Ganesh, you go ahead, and then I'm going to probably add some insights post. So go ahead.
I think what the capability that what you're going to have across the tool set, you can call it creep, you can call it sprawl, you can say the availability of all those capabilities across. It's going to be there no matter what. That's where the disruption comes in. That's where the enablement comes in. I say that a tool is not going to be the solution for you. It's about how you use it. And what is the value you get out of it is what the whole thing is about the tool, right? The other thing is about tool, as you said, how do you break the laws? The very big thing, what we see and what we do this within our own approaches when we go out is about not to rationalize the tools sometimes. Sometimes you have to have an extra tool because of the organizational culture and DNA that goes and facilitates for you to go back and get that visibility and traceability as well. Because it could be a structure of your organization because of all the convergence that's happening, especially in the big financial institutions. You're not a digital native yet, unless otherwise you're breaking the fintech space. You still have an enterprise legacy that you're trying to carry it over. So there's going to be a space that you have to, what I call is you crawl, walk, and run into that space before you go back and say, I'm good to go back and do it. So you're going to have the creeps, you're going to have the pros, you're going to have the complexities, but look at with an intent, with the lens of going back and saying, one, am I getting a visibility of something that's going to happen so I can anticipate it? Two, you know what, we can talk about, technical terms of testing, observability, all the other stuff. The big thing is what I say is, can I create a scenario and trying to get visibility on that? So chaos testing and all the other stuff, which will introduce and bring those things in. Can I have something to go back and fall on in such a way that my team can go back and try to anticipate and avoid those things as well? So if you need to have 5 tools, that's great. If you need to have 10 tools, that's great. But what in an average, what we see in the market is 6 to 8 tools across the space. And I bring it to the point of saying that, if you manage to an SLA, then you don't prioritize, you go back and try to work to something else. That's where the whole SLO-driven conversation that Brian was trying to come back and helps you out to do that. Maybe you need to have a polyglot solution to go back and solve the tool sprawl issues.
Yeah, Ganesh, I totally agree. I think that the other side of this, to your point, we kind of see a couple of different things happen. I think the most prevalent, though, is historically when we kind of watched the internal teams grow up in these different areas, right? There's always been a little bit of this is kind of my team, my project, my tooling infrastructure, my process, et cetera, right? And what we are also seeing a pretty heavy shift towards is we can't really operate that way anymore, because that's not really the way the cloud works in a lot of ways. We need to be able to start building a much more collaborative model where we're building that sharing economy within each other. And that really gets more to the process side of things, because if I'm able to collaborate, there's a function that maybe in the fullness of time, we might move to less tooling, to your point, Ganesh, right? But in the interim, I can't go rip that stuff out tomorrow. I can't change that. And I probably can't change that for a few years, even if I wanted to. So what we need to do is we need to start to encapsulate how our teams operating together and building on the work of each other. Because when we do that, particularly when you start looking at the infrastructure Lego bricks that we can kind of utilize in a more repeatable fashion, that then gets layered on top where we have tooling infrastructure, where we're starting to streamline process operations. Getting into that type of a model where we're able to start to abstract that away then gets us and starts to have us move into a more experimental or kind of proactive driven approach to the way we think about things. Ganesh, you mentioned disciplines like chaos engineering. I want to test something like the way that I'm going to stimulate what happens if a problem happens. The ability to do that when we don't have that level of collaboration and we're not starting down to build a more kind of repetitive operating model in that core operational and security discipline that gets enabled and really acts as a set of rails for developers to be able to operate freely. That collaborative approach is something that we're doing a lot of work within financial institutions to help them start to share those assets, because that allows them to build a model where they're constantly iterating on the work of each other to get better at cloud operations and utilization of cloud resources, which is very important. But the reason we're doing that is so that we can actually know that we're baking in what we need to have from a compliance, a governance, a reliability standpoint as a guardrail, so that developers are freed up to be able to do more of that. Let's focus on feature development and get ourselves abstracted away a bit from kind of these core functions that suck up quite a bit of operational and developer time.
So Eric, I acknowledge one last point down on this one, right? I think the way how I always have spoken to my clients a lot as well, especially asking about, hey, how do we address the complexity and address those is, as we all know, technology trends are always fickle, right? Like it's like a habit. It's something that you have to develop on with this. What the very big thing on a change management or process engineering, Eric, what you're talking about with all the new methods and DevOps practices and SRE practices, that's all that's coming up and in livelihood at the moment is the basic principle is if you as an organization can decouple your engineering teams to look beyond the boundaries of what you have today, then you enable them to go back and start looking at be it a feature development, be it to deploy it differently, be it to go back and have a visibility, that helps you to go back and do it. If you have the tight integrations where the silo-focused nature comes in, it's mine versus yours, that's where the restriction comes in. I believe with all the technology trends, what you have, there's a capability to do it, but hey, it's a human structure as well. So we need to go back and work through it. It's a process to get there.
So there's a question in the chat right now that's really applicable to this particular thread for Ganesh, which is from Sven. He asks, which kind of tool mix do you see in the market to gain enough visibility?
So there's not a one or two tool sets that you have. So what I would say is, like, to answer your question, I would say if you look at the continuum of a service in this construct, I'm talking about within the DORA space, what they call as a critical service functions, or if you take in a regular world architecture side, look at your capabilities or business critical services, what you got. If you go look at it, the continuum of the service is what is going to dictate your tools as sets as well. But the foundational fundamental observability part that drives you is about, hey, can I gather all the metrics and logs for me to go drive it? That's going to be the fundamental thing to do that. But there is a disruption happening in that market as we speak today as well. It's about, hey, how do I forward? How do I consolidate? How do I aggregate the data? Because there's a cost effect to it, as Brian said as well. So there are some things you need to have on that basic foundational, observability tool that you need to have. When I talk about observability in the sense from a metrics perspective, then you need to use that to go drive it. So I would say if you look at from a tool mix, right from service visibility all the way back to the operational visibility, you have to do it. Along the way, like as Maria pointed out, there are a couple of tool enablements that when she was pointing out what the hyperscalers are providing. So one of the things what we do and we recommend to the customers is saying that, hey, how do you build this continuous resiliency along in a way that you can avoid the tool visibility so that you can go back and, inject, for example, policy as a code or compliance as a code. Even if you can extend that in the way, one of the very big thought process, what we say is, how do you remove the architecture review boards out of it with the defined standards that Brian was referring to? How do I go back and do a fitness functions along with it? So if you are doing all these things, all I think I'm talking about completely an evolution, and you are going to have many number of tools to do it. But if you go back and have that integrated view, I would say you have to have a tool mix right from logging all the way back to the operational metrics with some visibility of the enablement tools as well. That's where we are saying 6 to 8 tools across the space. And I will share some tool mixes in the chat as well about what are the things that we see in the market. I'll definitely share with those.
Okay. Maria, we had an interesting conversation last week about how DORA is not necessarily unique. There are regulatory frameworks in Japan and, elsewhere. I only remember the one being in Japan. Why is DORA getting so much focus, given that it's another regulatory framework around financial institutions, just resilience and reliability?
I think what I was saying before, I think there's a clear shift in the interest of regulators globally from credit risk and market risk to op risk. That's a given. There's been a lot of activity at the international level from the Financial Stability Board, but also even on the insurance side. And you may have seen that the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision published some principles specifically on the topic of third-party risk management. So there's been a shift in focus globally, I would say. Europe was kind of an early adopter, and in the EU we like moving first. So Europe, it wasn't actually the first one. If you think the UK framework on op resilience, so DORA, as you know, there's a whole package of provisions impacting the financial entities themselves, and then there's a separate regime for what they call critical third-party providers. Mm-hmm. That's been done in one package. In the UK, was split into two kind of separate regimes. So we had the operational resilience requirements first that were implemented a couple of years ago already, and now they're going through the second phase on the critical third parties. And you said it well, in Japan, there is already a regime in place around op resilience. I think DORA, because it's a very holistic framework, has taken kind of the forefront in terms of the global regulatory reform process, and we're certainly seeing other regimes, similar regimes, maybe not DORA-like, but more focused on the operational resilience side in Mexico, in Brazil, in Singapore, in Hong Kong. So it's really a shift in the mindset from the regulated towards the and the focus put on the operational resilience side of things. Because as I said before, it is obvious in the current environment that operational risk is just as critical as credit risk and liquidity.
I believe the sentence that I wrote down from our previous conversation was DORA is not a compliance exercise, it's a standardization one.
I don't think it's a standard. I think it's a holistic framework that wants you to future-proof your business, mm-hmm. to ensure that you have best-in-class technology to withstand disruptions. And that's the way I think financial entities should be looking at this.
Dan, if I want to add to it as well, right? I think standardization helps you to get there, but it's not the prime motive. I think it's about if you want to increase the customer reputation and basically customer experience in a nutshell, then you're going to go back and try to think this from a digitization perspective. How can I get you capabilities in a way to do that, right? Yes, obviously standardization will help you, but I would think much more of how do I use this to modernize my ecosystem to keep up? And then can I go back and be ready for the regulators if something happens, if an incident happens to do it? That's how I would look at it rather than saying it's standardization.
Makes sense. So we've got about 11 minutes left in this, and I'm going to just start turning it over to attendee questions. Brian, I'll just kind of aim this one at you to begin with. Sven asks, at which company department do you start to make continuous resiliency happen, and who are the people you target for DORA?
Or maybe the question is, who's DORA targeted at? I would say, a great place to start are the people that are responsible for operations today, whether it is a site reliability team or organization, platform engineering, production engineering. It probably sits, like the standardization effort probably sits within one of those areas. But then I think to be successful with DORA compliance, it does take broad adoption. So, that might be sort of your program office, so to speak. But it's going to take effort from sort of everyone down to the individual developer to start to understand what it takes to meet these requirements. Because in always on, software as a service, we're all delivering software as a service, not just software companies anymore. It's sort of a shared responsibility down to the individual developer all the way up to the CEO, for everybody to understand what is required to deliver the right level of customer experience, and then to actually do that, which I think is what DORA is aimed at, because we all want to be confident in our financial system, right? We're not actually passing around dollar bills anymore. Most of our I would say economy is based on the reliability and resiliency of these systems. So it's critical.
And if I can just add to that, I think that's a critical point, because I think we all share, perhaps as never before, we share this objective of a more secure and resilient. None of us on this webinar, on this panel, or the regulators would want a bank to have a cyber attack and suffer the consequences of that. So we all share this objective of a more resilient and a more secure financial system, and having those objectives aligned, those goals aligned, I think is one of those opportunities that we really need to make the most out of them.
Eric, you got any different perspectives on who?
No, I think that everything that's been said is honestly spot on. I think a lot of it is the shift for a lot of companies that we're working with is, one, helping them understand how the cloud can actually become a more resilient platform, right? That's one of the core benefits, right? But a lot of that decision tends to kind of be different in a lot of different groups. I'm finding I agree that platform engineering is a major component area where that lives. Obviously, CTO and really the groups that are thinking about how are we transitioning these workloads out is another one. I think what's more important, though, is as a lot of the companies that we're working with are starting to try to say, how do I bake this type of a compliance regime into what I'm thinking about? That conversation, as we've been discussing, is also happening alongside the cloud adoption move and the kind of getting ready for that process in a larger way. That typically isn't kind of living with one group because everyone has a piece of it, right? So getting a chance to, and one of the groups that's kind of been growing up, if you will, inside a lot of the global financial institutions that we're seeing is more of like a cloud center of excellence or an office of cloud engineering, where they're almost working alongside all of the different communities that we're talking about, building consensus and kind of bringing them together, making a decision, not just kind of in this is the way devs are going to work, this is the way ops is going to work, this is the way we're going to think about security and compliance, but making sure that as they're looking at a regulation, they're applying a lot of those concepts together in kind of a future operating model, as opposed to just trying to put Band-Aids on business as usual across the different capacities and communities.
So, Dan, if I just want, it's a very interesting question, right? Which department, which firm to go as well. So that's you know what, obviously DORA financial institutions is where they're talking about. As Maria said, and Brian was articulating as well, right? It's about, yes, it's a shared responsibility that's been across. As a customer, we all are trying to protect, and we all have an expectation on a service provider about what way, whether you run an institution, whether you consume a service from a third party, whether it be a cloud or an API, whatever that could be that you're consuming out, you expect that reliability and resiliency to do that, right? So the question, I think what we see, as Eric said, yes, on the engineering aspect, because those are what I call that's where the plumbing and scaffolding happens to build the reliability and resiliency. But if you go back and look at where's the accountability that's being pushed upon from DORA, is not on one function or the other. It's within the broader enterprise, and the organizations and the clients are all trying to figure this out. So to answer the question, yes, I come from engineering. That's where we go back and try to make sure, okay, how the plumbing and scaffolding works, the evolution of platform engineering going into DevX, and how do you go back and standardize it? Absolutely, those are all the ways to get into there. But more and more what we see, I think I wouldn't say the mandate, the governance that comes across from compliance and risk officers getting into the engineering space is getting more broader now, right? They're not anymore writing controls and guardrails. Now they're saying that all right, let's make this plumbing and scaffolding work as well. How do we go figure it out? So all our conversations, most of them on tech resiliency aspect, is about saying that, hey, how do we take this? How do you go back and scale this within the organization as well? One of the evolutions that Eric was talking about is centralized. We started seeing observability offices in our organization for a hypermodal observability right now, because it's getting bigger for reporting, getting visibility as well. So there are evolutions that's happening in the industry. Within 18, my anticipation within 2 to 3 years, you will see a lot more DORA influence changing the op models.
So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. This one is for Eric, Maria, either one of you. As a non-financial institution, we are a third-party company providing SaaS solutions to financial institutions. We are getting more requests from financial institutions asking for audit rights. I wanted to ask if AWS is also seeing this increase in audit requests, and if so, how do you deal with these requests?
When I said
Maria.
oh.
No, please. Why don't you go first, and I'll provide color post is what I've seen in a couple areas.
Okay. So I said before that, DORA has a background in previous guidelines by the EU. So under the previous regime, so the guidelines that were issued by the supervisory authority, the issue of audit rights had already been considered by the European regulators. So our financial services customers had audit rights based on those guidelines, and what we provide our financial services customers, what we call a financial services addendum that reflects that gives out the ability of our customers to comply with those requirements. So DORA doesn't really change much in that aspect for us. The question around whether we'll get more requests on audit, that's to be seen. But we have experience developing what we call a community called CCAG in Germany. So it's a community audit, which basically it's a group of financial institutions that can collaborate and do a community audit on AWS. So there's different mechanisms whereby our customers can give reassurances that the regulators are looking for, so not just the audit piece. I would highlight that, but on the audit rights piece, contractually, that was already something that we had in place even prior to DORA. Eric?
Yeah, Maria, totally agree. And I think that what we have seen, so the short answer is yes. Broadly, that kind of agreement was already being in place, or agreement's probably the wrong word, but you know what as Maria was alluding to. I think that one of the things that we've seen definitely grow up, though, is a little bit more of that pressure to get better at the audit process and be able to create more of that reproduction of what went in from a bill of materials standpoint, not just at the infrastructure level, which we kind of handle for you, but as we've described in the shared responsibility model, being really able to say, if I've published X API or I've got this particular SaaS service that's out there, this is what went in to ensure the integrity of that workload. I think that the good news is both sides of that coin are happening. The bank is under that same level of pressure as they're driving these cloud migrations. And a lot of the fintechs that I tend to work with have a little bit more nimbleness in the sense that they've come out a little bit later versus maybe a bank that's been around for a number of years. And they've also have a little bit more of the purview of kind of leveraging some of these collaborative approaches, utilizing open source, utilizing kind of more streamlined operations where we don't have such a siloed segmentation that we do see in a lot more of the global banks, where some of the reproduction of those assets tends to be a little bit easier. They're able to kind of provide that in a little bit more nimbleness. And actually what we're seeing is some of those SaaS providers are actually providing guidance back to some of these regulated entities, helping them understand kind of the way that if I'm going to consume or leverage a SaaS service and plug that in potentially to some kind of other service that the bank may have or some other financial institution may have, there's a bit of a mind share that's happening to say, these are kind of the best practices we're following. We should try to help you come along in the same light. And I've seen that happen quite a bit on both sides.
We are at time. if I could ask one last question from the Q&A, because I think it's a good one, and then we can wrap it up and say our thanks. With resilience regimes emerging, what about regulators' awareness of cloud tech? Is there any particular area to focus on in awareness exercises? And I would add on to that, does it matter if they're aware of cloud tech, or are the regulatory frameworks in place to make it tech agnostic?
So Dan, if I want to go first, on that one as well, right? I think that's where a lot of conversations for us is happening. I would not say that awareness for one person or one group or one function in general, right? Because of all the technology capabilities that you're getting, the awareness is being heightened. I would say everybody wants to keep knowing it. So that's where we get a lot. What we say is like, I think we have a capability and an approach to go back and say, how do we go back and try to align it back to the regulatories as well? We have an advisory group who comes back and talks that's very specific for regulatories on those aspects as well. To Eric's point of saying that, hey, how do you go back and address that about SaaS providers and all the other stuff? If you go back and look at it, that's where the whole third-party risk management comes in across about, hey, how does DORA influence it as well? So when I refer to our matrix of 7x7, what I was talking about, hey, different areas we look at it, we look right from architecture to the compliance reporting. So that's where each capabilities come in, and it's a heightened awareness across the space, and it's a constant learning experience as well.
I would say I would emphasize the need for more awareness within the regulatory community, and I think it's a learning curve. But it's a learning curve for both sides as well. So I think that there is more need for the IT sector to understand what the regulators are asking for, and there is a need for the regulators to understand what the IT looks like. So it's a mutual. And I say this coming from the banking sector again. So there is a need for more dialogue, and certainly at AWS. We're doing our part on that. We're being very proactive, talking to regulators, not just in the EU but globally. But it's a two-way learning process.
Yeah, I think Maria and Ganesh, I would echo the sentiments. I think the interesting thing is I kind of came from public sector, so as we've kind of talked in the past, like we had FedRAMP, we had DoD SRG Impact Level X. There was a published standard. I think when we look at kind of the regulations that do get passed, these things like DORA are always excellent ways to kind of pivot and kind of think about how we might do things a little bit differently. The reality of the situation, though, is a lot of these regulations have been around for quite some time in the financial services sector, and all of them kind of do it a little differently, right? There's a regime, but the way I enforce that regime based on history, based on skill, based on tooling, based on language support, based on technology stack is just a little different. Right. So I think that we rely very heavily on the best practices that have kind of been deployed through our third-party ecosystem, because that allows us to actually focus on, I know you've done it, quote unquote, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, a little bit differently. And we want to help you under the shared responsibility model get very strong at building in that automation to ensure the posture that you need to adhere to, while we're helping you redefine what that may look like over the course of time. And I do think that there is an excellent opportunity for a lot of teams to reevaluate and rethink that. And then on the other side of it, we are partnering with organizations like Finos to be able to go and start to help build a little bit more of that consensus operating model, where if we're consuming cloud or we're enforcing a proper set of regulations under that shared responsibility model, that we're helping the community understand how to really utilize that in each of the deployments that they're driving, versus treating everything as a one-off, which is kind of what's been happening throughout the course of history, if you will. So it's creating a nice moment for all of us to kind of say, let's start building a little bit more of a consensus operating model. And to Maria, your point, we're taking an active role with the regulators to help shape what that can look like for the future of the financial services teams.
All right. Well, we've gone 5 minutes over, so I apologize for that. And thank you all for being flexible with your time. Ganesh, Eric, Brian, Maria, thank you all for the time today. This has been really informative and interesting. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I've tried not to ruin the great conversations that you've all been driving. And everybody have a great day. We will be sending around a recording of this after the fact. I will include the link that Maria shared earlier. Panelists, if there's anything you want me to include as a downloadable or as a link in the follow-up, just let me know after this. And yeah, have a wonderful day, everybody.